We're thrilled to have 4 colleagues from Youth Business International and Planet Finance share information on their innovative tool, which helps us understand the role that context plays in programming, policy making, and funding. Megan Reese, who is the Knowledge and Advocacy Specialist with Youth Business International, will kick us off by introducing the other speakers as well as this tool and framework. She'll also serve as the moderator of this 1-hour webinar. We welcome your questions and contributions throughout the learning event. Please write them into the chat box that's located at the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And we ask that you please keep your microphones muted. We also welcome your tweeting and Facebooking on key points that you take away from this event so that others can also learn about it. Please use the hashtag #PoundYouthU. As we have a lot to cover with presenters in the UK and France, I'm pleased to turn it now over to Megan. Thank you, Megan.
Great. Thank you very much, Whitney and Chelsea. Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining my colleagues, Laura Rana, Annie Barber, Stephanie Mestrale in France, and myself to find out more about the exciting Context project, as well as the development and testing of the Context framework. We would just like to take this opportunity as well to say a very big thank you to Whitney and the Making Sense team. Our organization here based in London, Youth Business International, is part of the Making Sense advisory group, and so we are especially delighted on this platform to present our exciting project and encourage sector participation in this testing phase. Before we begin getting into the nuts and bolts of the project and the framework, let me just start by introducing each of my colleagues participating in today's webinar. Laura Rana and Annie Barber are YBI's monitoring, evaluation, and learning specialists. Their role is focused on developing and implementing MEL systems for the YBI network's major partnerships, grants, and programs, as well as leading targeted projects to build the capacity of YBI's members in MEL. The ultimate goal of their work is to improve the quality and use of data from around the network to strengthen the global evidence base on youth entrepreneurship and increase program effectiveness. Operations Manager of Planet Phenom, YBI's network member in France. She's responsible for managing and coordinating 18 branches within the Planet Finance network. Her focus is growth management, coordination, and staff management, and she's a senior expert in microfinance, having gained experience in Cambodia and Madagascar, amongst others. And as Whitney said previously, I'm the Knowledge and Advocacy Specialist at YBI, and I work with Laura and Annie in the Strategy and Learning team. I have qualifications and experience in journalism, South Africa and the UK, and today, as the register mentioned, I'll be the webinar. Right, I just quickly wanted to run through the agenda for today for those of you who are going to be following us on the slides. Slide 3 outlines the agenda. After the introduction to the Context project, Laura will outline in more detail the objectives of the project and the development of the framework. Annie and Laura will then take you through the framework testing for young entrepreneurs as well as practitioners and present the findings and recommendations. And then we'll take you through the steps of the testing phase and let you know how to get involved. And that's also, not forgetting point 4, where Stephanie, our member in France, will give you feedback on her experience of being part of the testing phase. I'd also just like to make a brief mention about the Context project and the fact that it's being implemented by a consortium of Youth Business International, War Child UK and Restless Development through their Programme Partnership Agreement with the UK Department for International Development. The consultation is chaired by YBI, and the consortium commissioned the Overseas Development Institute to conduct research and act as secretariat to the consultation. Right, now we've got all that out of the way. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the Context project, which is all about maximizing the impact of youth entrepreneurship support in different contexts. As we know, today's webinar is focused on livelihoods and youth entrepreneurship. However, we feel that it's very important to note that context is an important and highly relevant factor to consider across all sectors. Understanding the context in which you operate and or plan to operate can really help you improve your operations enhance their design, and assist in delivering more impactful support and intervention programs. Many initiatives exist to promote youth entrepreneurship as a solution to unemployment, from providing training to young people who want to start their own business to venture capital funds to support investment in these businesses. However, when it comes to youth entrepreneurship programs, there is very little evidence about what works and what doesn't. This is particularly true when it comes to what works best in different contexts. Recognizing that there is no one-size-fits-all program is essential, as constraints young people face differ significantly across markets, cultures, and with regards to resources. Today's global youth population, as we all know, is the largest in history. 1.3 billion people exist between the ages of 15 and 24. These youngsters make up 1/4 of the world's working population, but they make up to half of the world's unemployed. According to a recent ILO report, some 64.5 million 24-year-olds were unemployed in 2013. This is up by 1 million compared with 2012. The global youth unemployment rate is almost 3 times as high as the adult unemployment rate. Indeed, as the ILO report says, the youth to adult unemployment ratio has reached a historical peak. Importantly, in the countries for which information exists, the proportion of young people neither in employment nor in educational training has continued the steep upward trend recorded since the start of the latest financial crisis. In certain countries, almost 1/4 of young people aged 15 to 29 are now neither in education or training. For many young people around the world, there is very little chance of getting employment in the formal sector, and self-employment is the only option for several. Helping young people earn a living through entrepreneurship can make a crucial contribution towards poverty reduction. While the core of most youth entrepreneurship programs, training, business development support, and access to finance, will to some extent remain the same, the binding indicators of a particular context will define not only the main problems to address, but also determine the solutions, who you should target, and how to design, implement, and deliver programs effectively. Matthias Limburg, who's a senior economist in the World Bank's Human Development Network, said the following about context. Understanding context is essential. The constraints facing young people differ enormously across countries, cultures, markets, and resources. The needs of a young entrepreneur in rural Sierra Leone are very different from those facing a young person in Freetown, the capital city, and even more different from a young person in Montevideo, Uruguay, or another middle-income country. One organization can't know all of this itself. But working with local agencies and partners, we can better understand what we need to do to help young people achieve their goals, Limburg added. It was with this realization that led Youth Business International, Restless Development, and War Child to conceive a study exploring how youth entrepreneurship support initiatives need to be prioritized and adapted in different contexts in order to maximize impact. The project is now in its 3rd phase. Phase 1, research and development, was conducted between 2011 and 2012. Phase 2, sector consultation, from April 12 to August 2013. And now the testing of the framework, which will finish in approximately September 2014. I'm now going to hand over to Laura, who can tell you more about the objectives of the project and the context framework tool, which has been developed through phases 1, 2, and 3.
Hi everybody. The project has 3 overarching objectives. Firstly, to share good practice and lessons learned more systematically across different operating contexts. So for example, if an evaluation shows a program in Chennai, India, has got strong positive impacts, can that same program then be replicated to Delhi, or are there specific key contextual factors behind the success not present in the new context that would prevent the same impacts from taking place? Secondly, understand how program delivery needs to be designed and adapted across different contexts in order to maximize impact. For example, our member in Uganda, an organization called Entrepreneurship Uganda, have a very successful youth entrepreneurship support program operating around Kampala. But we're now working with them on a DFID-funded project to take that approach up to the complex of affected area in the north of Uganda. So we need to understand how the context differs and how we need to adapt in line with that context. Thirdly, in order to allocate resources most effectively in order to support youth entrepreneurship across different contexts. So for example, again, if a certain context, for example Bangladesh, has a fairly saturated access to finance market, resources should be focused on the non-financial elements of support, as this would be where the gap is, and focusing on non-financial support could enhance the effectiveness of the existing financial support that is already being provided. We've identified 4 key groups of stakeholders who are interested in this issue and who the context framework is intended to support. Firstly, evaluation specialists, to be able to compare results from one context to another. Secondly, program implementers, to be able to design and adapt youth entrepreneurship interventions effectively across different contexts. Thirdly, policymakers and donors working at the higher level who want to understand how to better reallocate their resources across different contexts. And last but not least, the ultimate beneficiaries of the efforts of this project, young entrepreneurs themselves, who want to ensure are included and consulted throughout the process so we're able to improve support to them in line with the realities they're actually facing on the ground. So as Megan explained, we've had 3 phases to the project so far. Initially, under phase 1, the consortium, which consists of ourselves, IBI, in conjunction with Restless Development and War Child, commissioned a consultancy from the Overseas Development Institute, a London-based think tank, to develop a framework based on the existing literature. However, we soon realised that there's not much literature available, as youth entrepreneurship is such an emergent field. So instead, we focused on looking at the opportunities and constraints. 3 key dimensions of context were focused on: rural versus urban, the extent to which conflict was present in the context, and the level of economic development, categorised as factor-driven, efficiency-driven, and innovation-driven. These 3 dimensions of context were grouped together in different ways to construct 18 different scenarios representing the different combinations, from rural conflict-affected factor-driven contexts to urban, peaceful, innovation-driven contexts. Output sheets were developed for each of these 18 scenarios, outlining the opportunities and constraints present in that context, and providing recommendations for operating in the context based on the opportunities and constraints identified. Under phase 2, we undertook a sector-wide consultation that we actually had the pleasure to launch at the Making Sense International Global Youth Economic Opportunities Conference in September 2012. Other consultation activities included a dedicated website for the project, the formation of an advisory group, and various roundtable discussions with different types of stakeholders. We found that the initiative was warmly welcomed by the sector as being ambitious and important, but we were given 3 key pieces of feedback for improving the framework. Firstly, a number of dimensions were identified as being missing from the framework. Perhaps most importantly, the issue of organisational capacity, which is really important in terms of considering the feasibility of what best practice might look like on paper, whether it's actually in reality it's possible to implement these recommendations. Secondly, the recommendations in the framework, perhaps unsurprisingly, given that they were based on the literature, and there's quite, as I said, a lack of the literature existing thus far, were not sufficiently granular to be actually valuable in terms of being used to guide implementation. And thirdly, there was a need to localise the data. The initial version of the framework was based on national level data sources, because that was what was available in terms of comparable data sources. Whereas actually a lot of organisations, including our own members, focus on particular areas within a nation, or even within a specific region of a country, and so it's really important to look at what the actual context looked like at the local level. As such, we revised the diagnostic model. We added in the additional dimensions that had identified as being missing, but this would have increased the number of scenarios to an unmanageable level, and we also thought that the need to focus on organisational capacity was really important. As such, we developed a structure that included 3 modules: where I work, looking at the external environment; who I work with, looking at more detail at the specific kinds of young entrepreneurs that were being worked with; and how I work, focused on organisational capacity. We've then taken this revised diagnostic model, and under the current phase, we are going to be testing through a series of workshops. We've realised that as well through the consultation that we need different versions of the framework for different audiences. If it's one size fits all, we encounter the problem of being too generic to be useful. So we chose two key stakeholder groups for the testing phase to start with initially, practitioners and young entrepreneurs themselves, to focus on for this phase 3 testing. The objectives of the testing workshops are to validate and enhance the design of the contents of the framework further through the perspectives of those directly working with young entrepreneurs on the ground and the young entrepreneurs themselves, to test out the practical materials we've been developing in order to undertake the diagnostic and gather the recommendations, to test out the existing recommendations and build up their granularity through drawing on real-life best practice, and to understand where and how the framework can be useful for practitioners in supporting young entrepreneurs, as well as understanding how best we can engage young entrepreneurs themselves in the process. I'm now going to hand over to Annie, who's going to explain the testing approach in more detail and present some of the key findings from the pilot.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. We've now formulated the testing workshop materials based on the framework developed by ODI, as Laura just explained, and we've also completed full piloting of the testing, working closely with Planet Phenom, a member of the YDI network that's based in France. We'll introduce Planet Phenom shortly, and Stephanie will tell you all about her experience of the testing process. But first, I'll briefly explain the testing approach, and I'll give you a quick flavour of some of our preliminary findings from the pilot. So, on slide 18, you'll see we designed the testing workshop to include a short workshop with young entrepreneurs, followed by 3 core modules, which are focused on where I work, who I work with, and finally, how I work, as Laura explained. So, first of all, the Young Entrepreneurs Workshop. The overall aim is to solicit the opinions of young entrepreneurs themselves around what works where and why, and to create a space for them themselves to network with each other around common issues. So the workshop consists of a simple survey translated into the local language, which is sent out and completed in advance of the workshop. The survey touches briefly on the same 3 topics that we cover on the day, which include the main challenges of starting and growing a business, the kinds of support available to young entrepreneurs, and the main support gaps. So we analysed the results of the survey in advance, and we used extracts to stimulate more detailed discussion on the day. We also built in icebreaker exercises to encourage open discussion and to create an engaging and dynamic atmosphere. So in France, the workshop was attended by 9 local young entrepreneurs, and we had a mix of male and female, and all these entrepreneurs were at slightly different stages of their enterprise development. So this provided a really rich discussion. Our main findings are summarised on this slide, as you can see. And as you can see, the challenge of navigating complex administration processes was the most common finding in France. So as one young entrepreneur said, this is a direct quote, "I didn't know about all the things that needed doing in order to set up a business and how long it would all take. It's difficult to find guidance on all the administrative steps." And one of the most significant support gaps that we found on the day was that of post-startup mentoring support. And this was cited as a real difficulty for young entrepreneurs who'd already started a business, but were looking for that extra support to make it a success. So moving next on to the next slide, we carried out the practitioner workshop with Planet Phenom. And as Laura explained, each context is classified as one of 18 different types of context through the original diagnostic framework developed by ODI. So according to the framework and secondary data available, Planet Phenom operates in context type 18, which means it's innovation-driven, peaceful and urban. So therefore, throughout these pilot testing workshops, we were trying to build out recommendations for context type 18 and also to strengthen the diagnostic phase. So starting with module 1, where I work. This involves an open brainstorming. This involves three key steps. So first of all, step 1 was an open brainstorming exercise where, in line with the original framework, we examined the opportunity constraints for entrepreneurship in a specific context of Planet Phenom. And throughout this exercise, we were able to identify the 3 most important dimensions of the external environment for Planet Phenom. We reviewed then in step 2 the secondary data for these 3 prioritized dimensions and validated it according to the local conditions, highlighting any key discrepancies. And this is responding directly to the feedback from the consultation that the data wasn't locally relevant enough. And then the third step was to gather any recommendations from Planet Phenom relevant to operating within the specific external environment to build out the framework itself. So I'll just give you a quick snapshot of some of our Module 1 findings from the pilot. So for step 1, you can see here the 3 most important dimensions identified by Planet Phenom were level of urbanisation, and this is mainly because Planet Phenom's model is specifically designed to work in the urban areas, and so economies of value for money. The second area was identified as level of economic development, and lastly, institutional context. And this is really important for France because of laws and policies which affect the ease of starting a business and supporting entrepreneurs. So next, for step 2, localizing the data, this reveals several key discrepancies between the secondary data and reality on the ground. One example of this is France's high score in the secondary data regarding entrepreneurship culture, but actually the workshop highlighted the highly risk-averse culture and a lot of stigma around failure in the areas where Planet Phenom operates. Similarly, France is obviously classified as a political context, but there are high levels of unrest and social tensions in the sensitive urban zones, which is where Planet Phenom focuses its work. So, although officially classified as a peaceful context, they found discrepancies regarding this area. Okay, so moving next on to Module 2. This is focused on who I work with. This involves an exploration of key characteristics of the target group. So, for example, entrepreneur motivation, gender, ethnicity, age group, all these factors. So again, for this module, we went through a process of validating and localizing the relevant secondary level data that we had for France, and then we gathered recommendations from Planet Phenom around best practice for working with these specific target groups within their context. So I'll show you a brief snapshot of some of our key findings from Module 2. The Planet Phenom, as you can see from this slide, they work with inhabitants of sensitive urban zones, and these are mostly long-term unemployed and highly dependent on state subsidies. And as a result of very low levels of education and a lack of job opportunities, we decided to classify the target group as necessity-driven. As you can see, the Planet Phenom work predominantly with youth and have no specific gender target, although most beneficiaries are male, so between 66 to 70% of beneficiaries. And then finally, moving on to this follows 3 key steps. 1, a simple categorization of the organisation according to its scale and resources. And for this, we used an internal document from YBI, and we'd be happy to help anybody else with classifications. The second step is an open brainstorming of organisational strengths and challenges, and then we map these onto existing organisation capacity assessment tools, and just to make sure that we haven't missed anything and that we've covered all areas. And thirdly, categorization of the full recommendations that were developed in context type 18 from the original framework developed by ODI according to the 4 categories displayed here. So these 4 categories are relevant and already being implemented, relevant and aspire to implement, relevant but not possible to implement, and not relevant at all for this context. And the main reason for this is to use an exploration of organisational capacity as a filter, so to categorise the recommendations from the context framework to ensure that they're considered in line with reality on the ground in terms of resource constraints. And I'll just give you a brief example of some of the findings from this module and of how the recommendations were categorised in the piloting. So, of the 28 recommendations that are developed through the framework for context type 18, Planet Phenom found that 16, so more than half of these, were very relevant for their operations, and of these 16, half of these were already being implemented. So an example of this is the framework recommended that organisations evaluate the feasibility of young entrepreneur business plans, and Planet Phenom are already implementing this as a key step in their services to young entrepreneurs. In fact, they provide one-on-one support to make sure that business plans presented are feasible. Another highly relevant recommendation from the framework was to use role models and success stories to encourage and inspire. This is something that Planet Finance already do to an extent. They recruit successful entrepreneurs to be presidents of each of their local branches throughout France in order to promote the role models. But they'd like to increase use of ambassadors, potentially using famous sports stars, as well as hosting young entrepreneur breakfast sessions. This is something they'd like to do a lot more of. And then thirdly, the provision of microfinance was a relevant recommendation for Planet Finance. However, this isn't possible for Planet Finance itself, and this is due to strict regulations and legal frameworks in France around the provision of finance and the wish to avoid duplication of other work by other financial providers in the sector. So rather than provide finance themselves, Planet signpost the young entrepreneurs they support to the relevant organisations. And then lastly, Planet Finance sometimes participate in trade fairs and exhibitions. However, this recommendation was found to be not relevant because from their experience, these activities are very expensive and time-consuming, and they are quite unsure of the actual return on investment from these activities. So Planet Finance feel that this is, again, something they could do. They could signpost young entrepreneurs to trade fairs, but it's not currently a priority for them to offer them themselves. So I'll now hand back over to my colleague Laura, who's going to briefly explain how the piloting process fed into changes to our testing approach, and then we'll hear directly from Planet Finance around their experiences with the testing.
Hi again, everybody. So there's multiple ways in which our piloting the testing approach with our French colleagues has improved it. But I just wanted to point to a couple of examples just to give you a kind of concrete sense. Firstly, we realised it was important not to assume that the organisations that we're testing with have never encountered this issue before. So we've added an initial module prior to the modules Annie explained in order to avoid reinventing the wheel, where we focused on their existing thoughts and tools they have around this kind of context analysis, which has also been of benefit because we're going to be able to develop a toolkit of, in addition to our framework, but a bunch of other kind of tools of relevance to this issue. Secondly, we've added a stakeholder mapping exercise, again prior to the diagnostic modules that Annie took you through, because we realised through working on the pilot that it's really important not to assume that the organisations are operating in a vacuum, but to map out, kind of their strategic value in terms of entrepreneurship support. And then thirdly, we realised that we should go for depth over breadth. So initially, when we were piloting, we had the idea to take the organisations through all the different dimensions, and particularly for the module 1, where I work. But we soon realised that actually we totally run out of steam if we spread ourselves so thinly. And so we've reworked the approach so that we start up front with selecting 3 key dimensions that are the most important dimensions operating in that context and exploring those in detail. I'm now delighted to hand over to Stephanie from Planet Phenom, going to talk directly about her experience of piloting the framework.
Stephanie, are you there? Our colleague has dropped off the line for a moment, so we do have her slides, fortunately, and we're all set to do them as much justice as possible. Stephanie, if you can hear us, if you could just jump in when you come back online. So firstly, Planet Finance belongs or is part of the YBI network in France. It was started in 2006, particularly after the riots which occurred in France, in order to address some of the social and economic exclusion issues in suburban deprived areas. My colleague Laura, I'm going to hand over to her to discuss Planet Finance in more detail.
Thank you, Megan, and hopefully I can do Stephanie's slides justice. So some of the key comments you wanted to make is that the programme has been operating since 2006, so for 8 years now. And she feels that after this amount of time, when the programme has been growing really quickly and sort of the approach has been adapted based on lessons learned, it's really important to look back at your context. So context is the very foundation for the existence of organisations like Planet Finance. The organisation itself and the programme, the Entrepreneur en banlieue programme, apologies for my poor French accent in comparison to Stephanie, which is aimed specifically, as Megan explained, in these disadvantaged urban zones called the ZOOS. The programme the particular context in 2006 was the riots that occurred in these areas, associated with high levels of unemployment and frustration at a lack of opportunities for young people. And it was really felt that the young people had this great potential, but there was a lack of support. They were feeling very lonely, is how Planet Phenom describe it. They looked at the already existing services, so again, that idea of stakeholder mapping, and tried to see where the gaps were that they could fill. And they really felt that the gaps were this idea of the loneliness of the entrepreneur, that they needed some advice and support to talk them through, as Annie explained, the complicated institutional context in terms of complicated legal requirements and administrative barriers around setting up a business. So the program has grown from strength to strength. They now have 18 different branches operating across France in these sensitive urban zones. And an important element of the program is that the branches themselves are based within the local areas, so they're based within the actual zone in which they operate. And as far as possible, they try to employ local staff. They really understand the issues. There are those kind of power dynamics in communication around sort of the young entrepreneurs meeting with the staff. They aim to work with the young entrepreneurs throughout the journey through towards creating the business. Through a one-on-one mentoring service that is free at the point of use. And so far they have supported 9,300 people and created nearly 2,000 businesses, which has also created more than 2,000 jobs. And as explained on the slide, they always seek the support of complementary organisations. So again, going back to that idea of drawing on different stakeholders and really seeing where their niche is in the market, where they can add value rather than trying to do a bit of everything. Stephanie also wanted to emphasise, actually, in terms of her own background, that she's found it really interesting looking at her experience in Madagascar and her experience in the UK in comparison with the experience of working with the programme in France. Because she said you would naturally assume the context in France and the UK to be more similar, but actually she found a lot more similarities between the context in Madagascar and France in terms of the institutional and legal context, particularly around the ability to offer access to finance. Okay, then now going to her experience of the project overall. So I guess it sounds possibly less powerful coming from me, but firstly she just wanted to thank YBI for the opportunity to participate in the project. In terms of why they're interested in getting involved, firstly, as a member of YBI, they're always keen to learn from others. That's a key reason why members join the YBI network. She also felt, again, going back to the idea of the programme, having been successful and growing over the past 8 years, that it was time to sort of reflect on the processes, and also the idea of context analysis not being a static thing that you do one-off, looking at needs at the very initial stages of programme design, but it's important to revisit this and have like an ongoing contextual analysis. And also it's a good way to sort of get the team together and to really kind of thrash out again sort of the details of the mission and why they're doing what they're doing and what the needs are, and think through whether what they're doing actually does respond to those needs on an ongoing basis as the programme is growing. And in particular, they've been looking at the moment because they've been looking to grow both within France and then also outside France. They've had interest from other countries in Europe, so they really, that idea of thinking about how they need to adapt their programming for different contexts is very much a live issue for them at the moment. So we worked with the programme both at head office level in Paris and also at the field level. So we went to work with the team there to get a sense of sort of how these dynamics played out at the two different levels, and also how the framework was useful at these two different levels. And she and her colleagues at head office found that it really helped them to sort of challenge their existing methodology and go and identify key factors sort of behind the processes and why it was working, and potentially kind of avenues to explore in order to improve the process in line with the sort of ongoing contextual dynamics. And she said they got great feedback from the team in Saint-Quentin, the field office. We also asked her if she could comment a bit on why, well, firstly, whether she felt organisations should get involved in this testing phase, which luckily she said yes, and also why they should get involved. So again, she just said it's a great opportunity to sort of reflect on and improve your processes, and it's really important to involve as many members of the team as possible to really get those different perspectives at sort of both the different levels in terms of kind of head office versus field office, also maybe the different types of support offered. to really create a dialogue, and in a way that process is kind of as important as sort of the output in terms of, whatever the context diagnosis is and the recommendations you generate, that it's getting everybody together to sort of reach a consensus or, get debates generated around why they're doing what they're doing and how their programming responds to context. And some important things you wanted to flag up is to really think through who should be involved in the testing from your organisation, to mobilise the right people and make sure that they're around for the right amount of time. Again, Annie and I can give more guidance around how the process actually works for those who are interested in getting involved in testing. And also to really sort of accept that you should be looking honestly at your processes and be open for challenging and see it as a positive thing that maybe you can see ways in which things aren't working as well and you can improve them. And finally, again, this is going to sound maybe quite arrogant coming from me working from YBI, but she said if you work on it with professional organisations such as YBI, you'll be successful in achieving the aims of this project.
Fantastic, thanks Laura. And I've just got a Skype apologising for not being able to be on the line, and she just summarised 3 key points that she wanted to make sure we mentioned, and I think Laura's covered them, but just to stress that, she said it's always great to challenge and be challenged by others. The context framework is such a good way to learn and improve. And finally, she says, context is always changing. So whether you're a baby organisation or a mature one, it's a really useful exercise. So again, apologies from Stephanie for not being able to join. I'm going to hand it back over to Laura now, who's going to talk about the next steps for this context project.
So now the testing approach and the accompanying materials have been vastly improved thanks to working with Stephanie and her colleagues on the piloting. We're keen to conduct more workshops as part of the testing process, so I won't go into details of sort of all the different contexts we've identified, but YBI are keen to test it out with our members in India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Uganda and Kenya, all of which are DFID priority countries, remembering again that the project is DFID funded. And then also not forgetting our consortium partners. So War Child are hoping to test the workshop in Afghanistan. And Restless Development actually, so across the consortium we don't have that many common locations in which we actually work on the ground, all 3 organisations, but one of them is India. Restless Development and YBI both work in India. So we're looking into how we can undertake a joint workshop there. And Restless are also thinking about other ways in which they can test the framework. And then finally, Megan's going to pick up on it a bit more, but we're really keen, one of the aims indeed of this webinar is to try and generate interest in other organisations across the sector getting involved in the testing process, which will wrap up around sort of July kind of time, at which stage we're going to develop sort of an overall synthesis report and present the updated version of the framework, again if we need to make any sort of further improvements to it based on the testing, outline further next steps beyond phase 3. And present the materials themselves, and we're hoping to organise a sector-wide event sort of towards the end of September, early October, in which we're going to present the findings from phase 3 and so the next steps. So, hand over to Megan, who's going to close.
Great, thank you very much, Laura and Annie. I just wanted to take you through to the final part of this presentation, and that's just to give you some more information about getting involved in testing the context framework. Annie and Laura have given you a great deal of information so far about the framework, the piloting, their findings and key learnings. And Stephanie has also contributed through her slides. Unfortunately, she was having trouble connecting, but she has been exceptionally positive about the testing experience and what it has meant for them as a youth entrepreneurship support organisation. Right, so now just to repeat some of the points that Laura, Stephanie and Annie have already mentioned, but this is just why you shouldn't get involved in testing out the framework. Firstly, of course, it's all about sharing good practice and knowledge. It certainly will increase the impact of your support programs. It'll enhance effective resource allocation, and it certainly will increase knowledge and understanding. All these 4 points, as I said before, have already been reinforced. And I'd also just like to add here that you can test standalone components instead of the whole framework. And Laura and Annie will be able to provide you with more information about those which are most relevant to you. And ultimately, being part of this testing will provide you, your organization, the consortium, and ultimately the broader sector with valuable information, guidance, and raise key questions about designing, instituting, and operating the most effective youth entrepreneurship and intervention and support programs that you can. I just wanted to repeat as well that once again, you don't need to test the entire framework, but just sections of it which are most relevant to you, depending on time and resources available. I know a point that Steph did want to mention was that you do need to invest sufficient time in making the testing happen to get the most effective results, and also that we provide all the testing materials to you, but we do kindly request that organizations themselves. Lastly, if you would like to get involved, please can you connect with me. My email address is over there on the slide, megan.rees@youthbusiness.org, and we will certainly be in touch with you as soon as possible with regards to what materials we can provide to you and answer any other questions that you might have. And I'd just like to thank everyone today for making time to listen to this webinar. Thank you to Laura, Annie, and Stephanie in her absence, and also thank you to Planet Finance for agreeing to be part of our pilot testing phase and for your invaluable contributions towards the project. Last and by no means least, we'd just like to thank Whitney and her team and Making Sense for allowing us to present our Context project on this fantastic platform. So we'll now open the floor, or the webinar rather, to any questions we might have from participants. Thank you very much. Whitney?
Yes, thank you, Megan, and thank you to all of the presenters. If anybody online has a question, please type it into the chat box, and we'll wait a couple of minutes to see if any questions roll in. People typing, and Megan, please feel free as the moderator to field the questions to the appropriate presenter.
Great, I will do. Thank you.
Would any of the presenters like to answer the question from Lisa? What is your ultimate measure of success for this approach?
Right, thank you very much, Lisa. I'm going to pass on to my colleague Laura and then Annie to answer that question.
Hi, thanks for your question, Lisa. Very good question. Going back to sort of the original goals of the project, ultimately we want to support the key stakeholders who are working with young entrepreneurs to be able to do so more effectively and sort of not to reinvent the wheel, to be able to, develop, design and, adapt and implement programs in line with best practice that already exists out there, but also to understand the extent to which they, can't take best practice off the shelf. They need to adapt it to their own context. So I guess an ultimate measure of success would be seeing program implementers, donors, policymakers actually having an improved ability to be able to work with young entrepreneurs more successfully, and ultimately for those young entrepreneurs to be better supported.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Laura. And thank you, Lisa, for the question. And I think just one other thing to to add to this, in kind of the shorter term future, one key measure of success would be the continuation of this project into next year, which we hope will be stage 4. And as Megan mentioned, we were hoping to gather enough kind of evidence and input information around what works in these different context types, as well as improve the framework, to be able to build up some kind of online knowledge portal resource where organizations, perhaps from context type 18, similar to France, would be able to click through and access the different kinds of recommendations and lots of different information, maybe best practice tools, to helping young entrepreneurs. And that's a kind of vision that we have for the project that we're hoping to get towards. But it is a living project, and I think there's a long way. Okay, we're
Great. We've also just got a question from Pat Lee. Any work in the United States? YBI at this point doesn't have a member in America. Very happy to contribute towards, if you are interested in participating in testing the framework, we'd really be very interested in hearing from you and providing you with materials. Any testing that takes place in different contexts, we'd be great to get the findings and incorporate those into the updated framework.
One other thing to add is that although we don't yet have a member in the United States, this is an area that YBI is currently working on. So we are, as we speak, to recruit members from the YBI network. That's one for our network expansion team, who unfortunately aren't on the call. But Pat Lee, we'd love to join up with you about work in the US. Great. We're just trying to access any other questions that have come through. Having trouble viewing them on the screen at the moment.
I saw that there was one question around asking us to expand on our provision of financial support to young entrepreneurs. I'm not sure if that was a question for Planet Finance or for YBI. Stephanie can potentially type a contribution in terms of answering that from Planet Finance's point of view. As YBI, although the program, the EB program in France, doesn't provide financial support, it's restricted to providing non-financial support for some institutional reasons that Stephanie would have talked about in more detail if she'd been able to present. As YBI, we really see it as important to provide a holistic package of financial and non-financial support. So our membership is approximately 40 organisations operating in different countries around the world. They're all independent organisations. And they offer slightly different combinations. Some of them focus purely on non-financial support, depending on sort of restrictions around their ability to offer access to finance or if the market's already saturated in that regard. But generally, we really promote a holistic package of support because we believe that the non-financial support improves the effectiveness in the financial support, and that young entrepreneurs are more likely to be able to repay their loans successfully if they have access to training and mentoring that supports the effectiveness of their business in terms of growth and sustainability.
We've also just received, we're just having trouble viewing some of the questions.
We did have one question around in what context can this model be applied? Is it for organised groups or for ad hoc sessions? Sorry, the name for that question moved down because the chat box is moving quickly, but I'll try and answer that. And please chip in if I don't fully answer your question. This model for testing the context framework can be applied. Well, it's very flexible, basically, so we'd love to see it being applied wherever possible. So we do envision that some parts of the framework can be applied standalone in ad hoc sessions, just to generate as much information as possible. So although through YBI we're testing it with specific organisations who are members of our network, and we're planning to do full workshops, so that's covering all 3 modules as well as the Young Entrepreneur Workshop, we would say YBI can support you with materials to just do one Young Entrepreneur Workshop in a specific context, for example, or to just examine Module 3 and looking at the recommendations for that context type as standalone modules. So let me know if that hasn't answered your question. We're happy to talk more.
We also have a question from Elizabeth King about whether we borrowed the framework from another sector. If you can just expand on that, please, Laura.
Yeah, sure. So the initial framework was developed by ODI specifically for this project. It draws on some existing data sources. So sort of some data sources from the World Bank and the World Economic Forum and various others. When we share the testing materials with you, they include all the secondary data. So you can see more detail around that. But no, it was specifically developed for this project. And then as we've reconstructed the framework in terms of the 3-module approach, that's all been based on the feedback itself. There was also a question I think I saw around existing published materials that Stephanie replied to, saying that they don't. I'm not sure if it was a question for her or for us, but in terms of published materials on the context project itself, there are a couple of things up on the YBI website. I presume there'll be some kind of follow-up email sent to all participants, so we can add the links in there.
There's also a question from Pat Lee about how does one contact our fundraising office and get more information. We just want to clarify a point around that, and I'm going to hand over to Annie.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, so thanks, Pat Lee, for your question. YBI doesn't have a fundraising office, so we're not actually a fundraising institution. But what we can do, if you wanted to discuss more about working in the US, if you contact Megan Reed, the email that's supplied with this presentation, we can talk to you a little bit more offline around our US kind of ventures and how we might be able to support you in testing this over in the US. We're just checking for any other unanswered questions. If you just bear with us for 1 second.
Or if you feel we haven't answered your question, if you could just type it in again, then we can make sure we get to it, or at least try our best to answer it.
There was one question from Lisa around, has the webinar been recorded or will it be repeated? I think she missed the beginning. It's definitely being recorded, and I think Making Sense will kindly send around the links after this presentation so that people can re-watch it. It's going to be a YouTube recording, I believe.
There's also, I saw a question earlier on around our activities in Southeast Asia, and now someone's also asked about Pakistan. If you go on the YBI website, and again the War Child and the Restless Development websites, you'll be able to see details of where we all work at the current time. But just again to re-emphasize, with the testing of the framework itself, really we're open to all contexts, so any organizations operating anywhere that would like to get involved in the testing process. And again, as Annie mentioned, we have a specific network expansion team at YBI that focus on expanding our network. And if you email us, then we can direct you to those, so you can have a more detailed discussion offline in terms of sort of network expansion activities at YBI.
We've also received a question from Georgina Stoll saying we are currently designing a program which includes an entrepreneurship component for young people in rural areas in Central America. This all sounds interesting, but do we need to be able to apply tests by the end of the year? Annie?
Thank you, Georgina. That's an excellent question, and it does sound fascinating, your program in the rural areas of Central America. And we actually think there might be some crossover with some of our members of the YBI network who operate in rural areas in Central America. But to answer your question, ideally we do need the tests to be implemented by the end of this year if it's going to contribute to this testing phase. There was one slide that Laura talked through in the presentation around our timelines, and we're hoping to complete the testing for this phase between now and August, the end of August. So if possible, it would be great to test before then. We can offer you support, as we mentioned, and you can choose one-off components if you'd like. And then otherwise, we will be doing another event later this year in October to summarise all the findings from all the different testing workshops. And so if you're not able to get involved before then, perhaps there'll be a way for you to get involved in the next phase, which is yet to be determined for next year.
Yeah, we very much hope that this will be an ongoing project, as Annie said. So for this phase, it's finishing in July. And also just to emphasise one more thing, if anybody is based in London and wants to find out more about the project, we're actually having an in-person event next Wednesday, a smaller event in which we'll present the materials in more detail and kind of have a more detailed discussion around the testing. So just get in touch with us if you'd be interested in coming along to that. Again, online participation is welcome, but we sort of thought we would divide the two up a bit in terms of kind of the online and the in-person.
I also have a question here from Christina Erica Clavido. Is building a worldwide consortium of organizations implementing youth entrepreneurship programs part of the end goal? Phase 3 of this project is certainly not the end of the context framework project. Phase 2 is just the testing, after which there will be an updated framework which will continue to be a working document. One of the goals going forward certainly is to consolidate information we've received into potentially a knowledge portal, but we are very much in the planning stages of that at this point. For phase 3, we are aiming purely, at the end of phase 3, we're aiming purely to have an updated framework consolidating findings from the testing phase, and thereafter a knowledge portal which can be shared not just by youth entrepreneurship organizations, but by the larger sector. That's certainly something that we are thinking about at this point.
And I just saw one question on there from Chuck. Thank you, Chuck. Asking around, is there any way to contact other participants of the context testing workshops? And we would say absolutely yes. Here at YBI, we'll act as a central coordination function. So if you email megan.reese@youthbusiness.org, we'll be able to put you in contact with Stephanie, who's already said kindly that she's happy to talk to other people considering doing these testing workshops. And as we go along, we'll be able to put you in contact with more organisations who've already been through the process. So please do email us if you're interested. Okay, I think that's all the questions for now. If anyone has a burning question that we've not answered, please do type it now. Otherwise, we'll hand back over to the Making Sense team.
And you could always email us questions, obviously, if you think of questions sort of at a later date. Or if you want to have a more
thank you.
detailed.
Due to the time, we will have to stop the webinar at this moment. But for those who have additional questions, please do feel free to send them directly to the presenters. And the presenters will answer any unanswered questions that we have currently in the chat. So thank you all very much for participating, to YBI and Planet Finance for this excellent presentation and very succinct answer to all the many questions. We hope you all will join us at the 2014 Global Youth Economic Opportunity Summit, where we can continue this conversation. It will take place October 6th through 8th in Washington, D.C. For more information on the summit, please visit www.youthsummit.org. A topic like this one, and that's relevant to the summit, 5, the power of technology. Our 5 learning tracks are enterprise development, social inclusion. And we will, as they are on the page, where you will find additional related resources. Post your resource. Or otherwise in the field of youth economic opportunities. Please let us know. Feel free to email me at whitney@makingsense.com and visiting www.webinar.